high-end black and white inkjet printing. Now, it's not so much what you do with your inkjet printing, it's about what you don't do. Now, the first item is that I would not use grayscale for producing black and white inkjet prints. You don't use grayscale, you make sure you use RGB 8-bit mode images to hand over to your printer driver. You'll find that if you use grayscale, you will generate a certain level of noise in certain areas of your image if you're unlucky. So to avoid this, I recommend that you don't use grayscale. The second item, don't dispose of camera pixels. I recommend that you use our spreadsheet to decide what resolution, what document resolution you use. So if you're using a full frame 36 megapixel camera, for instance, I would advise that if you're printing to 600 pixels per inch for A4, for A3 I would recommend that you print at 420 pixels per inch because you've got more space, more area to accommodate your pixels. And if you're printing to A2, you can bring it down to 300 pixels per inch. So the smaller the size of print, the higher the resolution you need to set. And for 24 megapixels, for instance, if you're printing an A4, I would recommend that you use 480 pixels per inch. And if you're using a 24 megapixel camera for A3, you would set it to, let's say, 360 pixels per inch. This ensures that every pixel that you've captured is actually rendered at the print output. Third item, don't rely totally on your monitor. Now, a lot of people make this mistake. They adjust from RAW and they look at their image on screen and they'll adjust their sliders until it looks good on screen. Well, you've got to be careful of this. If your monitor isn't particularly accurate, there's a big difference between the resolution of your monitor and the resolution of your finished print. My advice would be is to try out at this level high-end printing. I'd be inclined to process in RAW with all of the sliders set to 0, no adjustment at all. Go straight through to Photoshop, don't adjust in Photoshop, and just print exactly as the camera captured. I think you'll be surprised at the clarity and tone that you've actually captured. We're saying no unsharp mask. Don't do any editing on your first off trial for a test print. I think you'll be surprised at the clarity and the quality of your print when you don't edit at all. Once you've looked at your print, by all means you can go back and you can subtly edit as you wish, but be careful not to fall into the trap of relying totally on your monitor. The next subject here is, well, again, don't over edit. You've got to be aware of clipping and blowing out on your black and whites. It's very, very common where you push your contrast a little bit too much and it doesn't look half bad on screen. It looks a bit punchier on screen. But the reality is that when you come to print, you've actually possibly blowing out your highlights, or you're clipping your shadows. My advice is, if you're ever wary of this sort of effect, is to go to your levels display and just see what your levels are looking like, just to give you an advance warning. don't use Camera Raw. Now this is a controversial one. My advice is don't use Camera Raw if you don't understand it. If you do understand it, I mean, there's very, very good online tutorials that will enable you to adjust and process in Camera Raw correctly. But if you're uncertain, be very, very wary of the adjustments that you can apply when you're processing in Camera Raw according to what you see on screen. So my advice there is get the excellent online tutorials for Camera Raw, and then you can be more confident with what you're doing. We've got a nice little set of links for you at the bottom of this video to show you where you can get free tutorials on this and other subjects. Next subject here is don't print in 16-bit. Now the vast majority of inkjet printers out there don't really like 16-bit RGB files. They far prefer an 8-bit RGB file. There are printers out there that can accept 16-bit, but they're very few and far between. My advice is, by all means, capture in 16-bit, and you can edit carefully in 16-bit, but when it comes to handing over your file to the output device, my personal advice is to change the mode down to an 8-bit RGB mode. This is a good one. Check your RGB values for a correct neutral just before printing. Now, when we're doing editing in Photoshop or Lightroom to a neutral, a nice black and white image, you can very easily, without quite realizing it, you can change the relative red, green and blue values without quite realizing it. So just in case you do this and you're introducing color tints into your work, my advice is that just before going to print, check your RGB values with something like the eyedropper tool and the Get Info palette, and that'll tell you that you've got level RGB values throughout the image so that you know that your pure neutrals are actually going to be pure. Let's go, now this is probably the most important part of all. Don't forget your basic photographic skills when creating your image. You don't want to store up a lot of work for yourself in Photoshop or Lightroom. Our advice, it's pretty straightforward. We advise you to capture a well-lit, a correctly focused and composed image which fills the frame similar to the desired appearance of the print. Now that's all very well me saying. Now you notice I've said here to the desired appearance of the print if you can. Now it's not always possible to do that, but if you can, our advice is that you try to visualize the finished product in the camera viewfinder if you possibly can. Now imagine that you don't have Photoshop or Lightroom to fall back on when at the point where you're actually creating your image. Imagine you're in the old days where you only had a roll of film in your camera and you only had so many shots that you could capture. Our advice is start with as near a perfect image as you can. That means to say that you won't have to do too much in your aggressive image editing software, which always tends to be just a little bit destructive if you hit the values just a little bit too hard. So our advice is start with as near a perfect image as you possibly can. Don't destroy the quality of your image at the editing stage. Print accurately and print well.